Welcome to Firing Line. I'm Michael Kinsley of the New Republic magazine. The ongoing debate over affirmative action is the most toxic controversy in American politics. Whether that toxic quality derives from affirmative action policies themselves or from demagogic misrepresentations of those policies by opponents is the subject of a subsidiary debate of its own. Mr. Buckley's guest, Stephen Carter, is a professor at Yale Law School and author of the best-selling book Reflections of an Affirmative Action Baby. That book begins with a confession. I got into law school because I am black. But Mr. Carter goes on to confess ambivalence about the affirmative action policies that have benefited his generation of black professionals. He has two objections in particular. First, the way affirmative action aggravates what he calls the best black syndrome, the belief among whites and even among blacks themselves that blacks are only capable of being measured on a separate scale. And second, the tendency in some affirmative action to treat blacks as a group with their own special way of thinking and not as individuals. Conservatives have been anxious to embrace Mr. Carter as another convert, overlooking as usual the anomaly that they prize him especially because of his race. But Mr. Carter rejects the embrace and even continues to endorse affirmative action in limited forms. Mr. Buckley, one of the most distasteful aspects of the recent Clarence Thomas controversy, to me, even before the Anita Hill sideshow, was the way Judge Thomas and his supporters played the race card so heavily. If you're going to oppose affirmative action and so on, shouldn't you be especially slow to claim lynching every time somebody says something you disagree with?
Well, I was myself rather surprised that everyone assumed that Judge Thomas was using that word in implying the singularity of the black experience, because I've heard the word used and use it myself simply to mean mob action. Now, on the broader question of whether a black should publicize a success story as remarkable as his own, it seems to me that that is a matter of natural pride. It would have been unusual for him to disguise it rather than to stress it. Have you got a problem with that?
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with Judge Thomas talking about his background. It is an American success story and one he should be proud of. The trouble I had with the way the hearings went was that so much of the time the success story, which is admirable, was treated as though it was the only necessary answer to all sorts of questions. I remember Brent Staples wrote in the New York Times that it was not Judge Thomas's grandfather who was being nominated to the Supreme Court. Yeah. And at some point one had to ask, not Judge Thomas so much as his backers, who I think did him a disservice, wanted to ask them, is there anything that you are pushing about Clarence Thomas aside from his admittedly admirable and remarkable success story?
Yeah, that's right, because of course, to the extent that he was successful, it was because his qualifications were recognized by the president or his committee or whoever, so that he was presumptively successful the moment he was nominated, right?
Well, in a sense, you know, the qualification issue is a very shaky issue, both in affirmative action debates and also in debates about Clarence Thomas.
Yeah.
I think that the president, of course, said that race played no role in the selection process, that Clarence Thomas was the single most qualified individual. I don't think many people took that claim seriously. I think the president probably could have done a lot of work toward binding up some of the racial wounds in America had he said it was probably true. There were many outstanding candidates, people I thought would have done a good job, and I used race as one means of sorting among them.
Well, I agree with you, but he probably reasoned that were he to say so, he would be himself engaged in an act of affirmative action which is supposed to be against the doctrines that were regnant as recently as 15, 20 years ago.
Well, you know, the president does have a bit of a problem there since he was engaging in exactly what he opposes.
That's right.
That's not a knock on Clarence Thomas. I think one has to be sensitive to the possibility that there are many different kinds of affirmative action, and it's a mistake to try to lump them all together to say that they're all objectionable.
Well, that's true. He could even have used the Buckley defense.
Well, he could have used a lot of defenses, and I don't think his action needed defense. That's the point. That was where he made his mistake. The president seemed to be under the impression that unless he could make a case that race played no role in the selection, there was something wrong with the selection process.
Yeah.
But I think that when one is sorting among many highly qualified people, which is what the president claims to be doing, that the idea that race may play a role in making that selection as against reaching way down the list to pick up someone he might not otherwise have picked up, I don't know why the president should object to that, and I think the president, again, could do a great service to the country by trying to draw that distinction.
Well, I agree, and there's nothing in your book that is contradicted by your making that point. That is to say, if down the line, group characteristics or that which distinguishes one group of people from another group of people evanesces entirely, the point is surely that moment hasn't yet happened.
Well, that's right.
so that the experience of Clarence Thomas might in some way illuminate his judicial vision,
Well,
provided he doesn't become a creationist, a constitutional creationist.
Well, that's possible, although I want to be a little bit careful about the claim that one's ethnic background, one's life experiences are an important clue to one's judicial philosophy. I'm not sure that the experience bears that out, and that can take us down a very dangerous road toward a form of affirmative action to which I do object. And that's the claim that the reason to bring people of color into the corridors of power is not simply integration, which I support, but rather that there's a special voice that has to be represented. And the reason I object to that is not because I doubt that black people and white people forged in the crucible of American society are going to be different. The reason I object to it, rather, is that it is a very small step from saying there's a special distinctive voice that has to be represented to saying that some black people who don't speak with that voice shouldn't be in those powerful positions. I think that's what Clarence Thomas ran into in his first set of confirmation hearings. There were people who acted as though a black person with his views was somehow the wrong kind of black person. I don't agree with all of Clarence Thomas's views, but I find that a terribly offensive way of making choices about who ought to serve.
Well, I do too, and I very much regret, under the circumstances, his awful showing on the stand. It would be almost impossible to know what his position was on anything. I assume he was simply acting that way because he was told to do so, and it's true of many of his predecessors.
I guess that's probably right. It's kind of unfortunate that we've reached this strange point in our dialogue over Supreme Court nominations where that's what people are really encouraged to do, to say nothing.
Yeah.
I think there's a difference between taking the perfectly proper position that says, I won't tell you, the Senate, or you, the President, how I'm going to vote, or give you information that gives clues to that. There's a difference between that and saying, I won't engage in any deeply substantive discussions about legal issues. I think that's a really terrible thing, although you're absolutely right that everybody does that. But here it reached an unfortunate low. Again, I don't blame Judge Thomas. I blame those who advised him. When he was asked, had he ever discussed Roe versus Wade, and his answer was he'd never had a serious discussion about it with anyone. And no one, I think, seriously believed
if that was true, I would vote against him.
Because of a lack of intellectual curiosity.
That account, yeah.
Sure. Well, that's a terrible thing. But you know, actually, if you go back and study confirmation battles over the years, which is one of the things that I've been doing for some years, I write a lot about the confirmation process, it turns out there are very few instances in which nominees have entered into long discussions about legal issues. Robert Bork did, and you saw what happened to him.
Yeah.
He was trashed almost as a result of that and little else. Most of the people have said no. Justice Marshall, whom I greatly admired, whom I served as a law clerk, when he was nominated in 1967, adamantly refused to answer a long series of questions from the Judiciary Committee about his views on particular controversial precedents in the loyalty security area and in the criminal justice area. And one of the remarkable things about that is the only two members of today's Judiciary Committee who were on the committee that considered Thurgood Marshall are Strom Thurmond and Edward Kennedy. And in 1967, Strom Thurmond said, we, the Senate, can't make up our mind if he won't tell us how he plans to vote. And Edward Kennedy said, it's none of the Senate's business.
Those interesting paradoxes happen and happen all the time. Those black spokesmen who said, we'd rather have a white conservative than a black conservative were in effect saying that no black who respects his experience has any right to be conservative. But that this, and you touch on this point, this really has to do with a perception of a political monolith, substantially justified by the voting figures, right?
Yes.
Now, I heard an analyst, one of the sophologists, say recently that if the black vote reduced from 90 to 70% for the Democrats would be absolutely through. They'd be out of business. They wouldn't get a single state or a single congressman or a single senator. Now, this suggests the terror that Democrats have to feel at the continuing spectacle of a black in this august position as a constant reminder that it's possible to be black and to think differently from the ACLU.
It's not only that it's possible, in many ways it's likely. In fact, if you move away from civil rights issues or social welfare issues, which unfortunately tend to be the only issues which most Americans care what black people think, look at other issues where we tend to measure liberal, conservative, organized prayer in the public schools, abortion, the role of women in society, rights of criminal defendants, the environment. On each of those issues, consistent survey data indicate that the median black voter is to the right, as we would say it in America, to the right of the median white voter.
Yeah.
So one would think in some ways, well, you'd say, gee, the black community is in many ways a pretty conservative community. And on all sorts of social issues, that is absolutely true. In fact, on the rights of criminal defendants and on prayer in the public schools, the black community forms one of the strongest communities in survey data against what one might think of as the prevailing legal and political position. But those voters...
Which was what led National Review to publish a while ago, and you make sport of it in your book, that probably the first black president of America will be a conservative Republican.
Well, I don't so much make sport of it as I suggest that even if that's true, that the problem that the Republican Party has is it first has to get prominent black Republicans elected to positions from which they're going to have a serious pulpit. I think one of the problems that the Republican Party has is there's a kind of image problem the Republican Party has. There's a sense, I think, that a lot of black people have that the Republican Party doesn't really care much about black people except that it's against affirmative action. And other than that, there's really not much concern out there. And I think that many, many black people, probably most black people, see the Republican Party that way, and as long as that perception is there, there is never going to be a substantial number of black voters who vote Republican. So the Democrats will continue to get the 88, 90, 92% figures. And that, I might add, is a problem the Republican Party or the conservative movement has to change. That's not something one can ask black people to voluntarily try to do.
No. But that touches on an interesting point, which is the nominalist approach to politics and how efficacious it compared to be. Governor Kane here, who got 60% black votes in New Jersey, in answer to the question, how do you go around doing it, he said, well, I showed him I cared. Now, I would go to black districts and talk to them and appoint a number of them, but Reagan appointed more blacks in California and in the federal government than any preceding governor or president, but it didn't do him very much good. Charlie Rangel, the prominent House congressman, said, you know, this was not on firing line, but he said, you know, if Bush had nominated Colin Powell for vice president, you could have kissed goodbye to the Democratic Party. Now, this is probably hyperbolic, but he seems to believe that. So is it correct that an approach, however nominalist in character, to blacks have these miraculous effects?
Well, I don't want to oversimplify the point. I don't think that black people lurch toward the nearest black candidate. That's not the point at all. Rather, my point is that without regard to whether the face is black or white, and Alan Keyes got a very small portion of the black vote when he was running in the Maryland Senate race, for example, in the suicidal race. Yeah. So it's not just that black people vote for a black candidate. My point is somewhat different. My point is that if black Republicans become electable and appeal to white Republicans sufficiently well to be elected senators and governors, and then begin to speak out on issues, and if also white Republicans begin to speak out on issues in ways that black people will find attractive, black voters like voters of any other kind. That if people seem to be interested in the things that black people are interested in, black voters will vote that way.
Well, now, how would a black voter running on a Republican ticket attempting simultaneously to vote for those blacks you finished discussing a moment ago, and to whites, how would he get over the barrier of the welfare problem and affirmative action?
Get over the barrier in the sense that black people care deeply about that?
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question. The trouble with the affirmative action issue, the way it's handled by the Republican Party, I would say, is this. The Republican Party, what black people know about the Republican Party is that it's against affirmative action. Now, there are millions of black people who are against affirmative action. There are people like myself who like some things about it, not others, and of course there are millions more who are in favor of it. But those millions of black people who are flat out against affirmative action are still, I think, reluctant to vote Republican for a black or white candidate, as long as all they know about the Republican Party's position on civil rights is that it's against affirmative action. I think things like the way the debate over the 1990 and 1991 Civil Rights Act was handled don't help the Republican Party very much. There you have the president talking constantly about not wanting to sign a quota bill. Now, we could debate endlessly whether that was a quota bill or not. I don't think so. The president obviously thought that it was. I thought it was a good piece of legislation. But the point is that whether the president thought it a quota bill or not, there was very little that the president was saying that made a positive case about why he thought any civil rights bill was important. One almost had the impression, except for a few throwaway lines about, of course, I want a bill, one also had the impression that the civil rights bill went away, the president couldn't have been happier. And that's not a way, I think, to appeal to black voters. Even if one is going to say, I won't sign a bill with quotas in it, one has to say, but these are protections I do think are needed. These are some aspects of civil rights law that I do think need to be improved. Let me tell you how I'm going to do that. Let me lay out a scheme. That's what you have to do. Black people are not stupid. You know, you sit there and you have a conversation with a black voter, whether by television or any other way, as you do with any other voter. And that kind of conversation, to make a lot of black people feel that maybe the president does care about civil rights, whatever he may think about quotas, that kind of conversation, I think, is very important.
Well, I think you're right. And since Mr. Bush is not a naive man politically, can't we assume that he probably has said that? The reason I say that, pose that as a question, is that I haven't heard him say that. But it's a man-eats-dog problem, isn't it? The networks aren't likely to give us any software on the president on civil liberties. They're likely to inform us only about that aspect that's sort of, so to speak, racy.
Well, I think there's something to that. That is, the idea would be that if the president gives a long speech and there's one anti-quota line, they're going to run the anti-quota line. That's possibly so, although this issue is played this way in a lot of other publications and a lot of editorials and things that I read about this, and sometimes in conservative publications, the quota issue is what's highlighted. There's no long discussion of other aspects of civil rights that need to be improved or protected. But even assume that what you say is true, the president, of course, and here perhaps I will expose my own naivete, but the president has always at his disposal the one means of going over the head of the media, which is to say, I want to make a televised address tonight about civil rights and talk for 20 minutes or half an hour and lay out the entire positive program without being subject to network cutting and censorship and so on.
I'm going to go 20 minutes only to those civil rights I believe in.
Well, whatever, however he wants to put it. I think
you have a provocative chapter in your book about conservatism. I think people would like to hear what it is that you gag most over in respect of conservative contemporary thought.
Well, you know, I wouldn't say that I necessarily gag over a lot of things, but there are a lot of things about, there are some things about the conservative movement and about conservative thought, at least in its political essence, that do bother me. One is what I've just mentioned, which is or I should say, one is a larger part of what I've just mentioned. There's a tendency to always seem to end up on perfectly principled grounds, but always seem to end up taking a position that is going to upset black people the most. And is something that bothers me about a lot of different threads of conservatism. But there's something else, too, I think. And I'm not sure exactly what it is you're referring to in the book, but the one thing I would like to mention is this. I think that sometimes on a lot of issues, the best way I can put it is that the rhetoric goes too far. That is, take affirmative action as one issue. I mentioned in the book the rhetoric comparing affirmative action to apartheid and so on, or to Jim Crow, or whatever may be the problems one has with affirmative action. This seems to me a very, very stretched and difficult comparison to make, and of course for me I think a very offensive one. But there's another sense also which I think the rhetoric sometimes goes too far, and that's that there's often a suggestion that no government programs are any good, that every government program is bad, and some government programs I think are good. Some government programs, especially like Head Start is a good example, have worked and worked well, and the more that one was willing to make the kind of improvements in education and health care that we know do lead to better academic achievement and better job achievement later on, the more one is willing to spend the money to do that, the more I think that one can talk about it's phasing out some of the broad affirmative action plans that so gall many conservatives. And that, of course, leads us to the T word, which is the problem of taxes. Now, it has been a centerpiece of most, not all, conservative thought recently. Recently, for the last decade or so, that taxes generally seem to be a bad idea. That
you don't buy civilization with them.
What?
That you don't buy civilization with them.
Well, that's right. That's the graceful way of putting it. But yes, that somehow that taxes themselves are an evil. You know, I was raised very differently. I was raised by my parents to believe that paying taxes to the government of the United States is a privilege and not a burden. My father always said he believed in paying a little extra on his income taxes because the government of the United States deserved it, because this was the greatest country in the world. The future is expensive, and much of the rest of the world understands that. At the same time that we talk about our tax rates being too high, there are countries that have not only nominal but effective tax rates that are higher than ours, and whose economies seem to be going great guns.
Well, we better get into that because
All right.
that would distract us. But in other words, you were raised as though paying taxes was like giving money to missionaries. The more you give, the better off you are.
Well, you know, it wasn't my thought that every penny should go in taxes, but my view is that a citizen, I as a citizen prefer to take this view. I'm not going to vote against the government because it's raised my taxes.
Yeah.
I'm going to vote depending on what the government is using that money for.
Yeah.
I will vote if the government imposes programs that I don't like. I will vote against the government on that ground. But my view is that as a citizen of the United States, I have a responsibility to pay my share of the bill that's run up by our democratically elected representatives. And if I think the bill is too high, my reason should not be they're just spending a lot of money. My reason should be there's this and this and this and this they're spending it on that I think is wasteful, and if they don't change those things, I'm going to vote them out of office.
Unhappily, it's not easy to instruct the government that it's doing too much. Last night I saw on 60 Minutes a great stretch on the Rural Electrification Association, which is engaged in lending money at 5% to multi-billion-dollar companies, because there isn't money left without electricity. But any attempt to eliminate that that completely outmoded outfit simply runs into inertia. But one thing that you have a very low threshold for sophistry.
I try.
Yeah. Now, in the Buckley decision, you distinguish between affirmative action of the kind you disapprove of and affirmative action of the kind endorsed under Buckley, don't you?
Yes, that's right. That is, but let me make clear about what I like about the Buckley decision as well as what I dislike about it, which perhaps I don't talk about as much. The first thing I want to make clear is that any use of race, any affirmative action program, has some bad side effects. There's always the risk of reinforcing what Mr. Kinsley described as the best black syndrome. There's always a lot of other risks of that kind. Nevertheless, my view is that at this point in our society, sometimes the risk is worth it. Sometimes the benefits are sufficient to outweigh those risks or costs.
Sort of putting it through the Benthamite ringer.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I try to do. It is a kind of utilitarian calculus, and one has to make these judgments. At least I think one has to make the judgments unless one has a better idea about how to move toward a racially just society. My view about affirmative action, pardon me, my view about affirmative action in college and professional school admissions is that can be justified as a way of giving opportunities that might not otherwise exist for people of color to show what they can do, and that those opportunities, if one runs with them, can help lead us toward a more integrated society.
Excuse me, I have to interrupt. We're running out of time. On that very note, Mr. Buckley, do you concede what George Bush was unable to bring himself to concede in nominating Clarence Thomas, which is that there are circumstances where it is not only legitimate but socially useful to give racial preference to black people when in the same situation it would be offensive, if not illegal, to give racial preference to white people? That that it is not a two-way street.
Yeah, it's a very taxing question, among other things, because for years I've been in favor of affirmative action in the private sector, against it in the public sector, on the grounds that to do so is concretely to diminish the rights of other people. I would have to admit that if I were president, I would look for an opportunity to nominate a black and I hope I would say that one of the reasons I was nominated for was black. However, there's a sense in which one wants to be discreet in the sense in which prudence is a virtue. And to the extent where I said, I picked him because he's black, I'm looking for a black, caused a certain amount of resentful commotion among qualified whites.
But hasn't the way President Bush and others manipulated this gone beyond discretion to a lack of discretion in the other way by constantly harping on quotas, purposely stirring up the very resentments that you mentioned?
Well,
for political reasons.
For instance, take the Willie Horton business. People, our side says, when we look at the picture of Willie Horton, we saw a criminal. Their side says, when you look at Willie Horton, you saw a black. So now they're not going to do that kind of thing again, although I think reason subsidizes my point of view on that rather than theirs. And you've got the same problem here, do you not?
Well, you do have a similar problem, although with Willie Horton, I think the correct answer is that everybody saw a black criminal, and the question is what effect that might have had on the nation's often tortured racial psyche.
They could have found a white rapist who'd done the same thing, as you find, yeah.
Well,
we've been signed off. Thank you very much, Professor Carter, author of Reflections of an Affirmative Action Baby, Michael Kinsley of the New Republic, ladies and gentlemen of St. John's.
Next week on Firing Line, William F. Buckley Jr. talks with ACLU Executive Director Ira Glasser about his book, Visions of Liberty, the Bill of Rights for All Americans. They focus on the First Amendment's protection of religious freedom. Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support was provided by the Annenberg Foundation.